When I agreed to give this talk, it was several weeks before the lockdown, and the circumstances were very different. I imagined that I would be sitting in the shrine room of the North London Buddhist Centre, face to face with an audience I could see and respond to. And I imagined that that audience would be made up of people who are doing their jobs in the usual way. Instead, here I am talking to my laptop in my house, and I'm not really able to see my audience or read your facial expressions very well. And also, most of us are either working in very new ways, or we find ourselves no longer able to work at all. But these sudden changes in our working lives can offer us an opportunity to reflect on how our work affects us and what it is that our occupation or our livelihood means to us. I'm going to stick with the original structure that I planned for this talk. I'm going to look at the whole issue of work or livelihood in three distinct parts. In the first part, I'm going to consider some general points about how we are affected by our working lives. In the second part, I'm going to take a look at what traditional Buddhist literature says about right livelihood. And in the third part, I'm going to look at how contemporary Buddhists have tried to develop the idea of right livelihood. It's all going to take about 30 minutes. So make sure you're sitting comfortably. And I'm not going to use any visual aids. I thought it was quite enough of a challenge to do this by Zoom without making it complicated with stuff that could all go wrong. So it's just going to be me talking. So let's start with a look at work in general. If I was delivering this talk in front of a live audience like I'd originally planned, then I'd start off by asking the people in the room how many people knew how to make a cup of tea. I'd probably actually ask people to put their hands up if they thought they knew how to make a cup of tea. And I'd expect that most people would raise their hands and say, yes, they could indeed make a cup of tea. And then I'd laugh and tell them that they were all completely absurd. There's nobody in the world can make a cup of tea, at least not on their own. No one on their own can grow the bushes, harvest the leaves, package them up and transport them across the world, let alone purify the water, generate the electricity, make a steel kettle and a porcelain teapot and a nice little cup and saucer. And that's before we even think about milk and sugar. The CEOs of Tetley's or Taylors of Harrogate can't make a cup of tea. To make ourselves a cup of tea is the final act in a huge team effort. It's only possible because we depend on the work of tens of thousands, maybe millions, of other people who we mostly never even see. They mostly only work because we pay them. And we pay for their work by offering our work in exchange. We cannot possibly do everything for ourselves. So we pick something we can do, find someone to pay us for it, and use the money we earn to buy the products of the work of literally millions of strangers. My question, who can make a cup of tea, may seem like a bit of a cheap trick question to you. But it's a trick question designed to make people think. And specifically, to try and make people think about how intimately connected we are to everyone else in the world. And indeed, also how intimately connected we are to nature, which gives us the raw materials, if we treat it right. It is through our work that we express that connection with the rest of the world most strongly. Work is an expression of the famous Buddhist metaphor of Indra's net, of seeing the universe as a great web of connections, a mesh that links everyone and everything to everything else. We use work to give what we can to the world. And in return, work gives us the means to take what we need, or what we think we need anyway. And work takes up a huge amount of our time and energy. We may like this, we may not. It is fair to say that work can be boring, annoying, and stressful. If we are unlucky, we may find that the work that we do is dangerous. The virus has made some previously safe jobs suddenly much more dangerous. I'm thinking of bus drivers, for example. There are some jobs where we may feel exploited or feel that we are exploiting others. And some jobs may harm us or make us harm others. Let's face it, if people want to moan about something, then work is pretty near the top of the list of things they want to moan about. But we need to look at the many positive aspects of work. In his best-selling book on happiness, the economist Richard Layard has discovered that people in work are significantly happier than people without work. That is especially true if the work is secure, with a predictable income and no fear of unemployment, and if it doesn't take us far away from our family and friends. So much as we may moan about it, work actually makes us happier. After all, millions of people around the world choose to work for nothing. One very well documented example is the unpaid work of homemakers and child carers, who are overwhelmingly women. But this Buddhist center offers another example. Many of us work here for no pay because we get our rewards in other ways. We certainly get plenty of job satisfaction here. Work gives each of us an identity. We say, I'm a bus driver, or I'm a teacher, or I'm a shopkeeper. Work gives us a structure and a pattern to our days and our years. Work lets us learn new skills and acquire new knowledge. Work can broaden the mind. It brings us into daily contact with people who are different from us, people who look different, who have different ideas about politics and religion, or different tastes and habits. Work lets us give to the rest of the world as well as taking from it. In so doing, it challenges us to develop as people. If there's one thing that's worse than work on Monday morning, it's no work on Monday morning. Our choice of jobs is influenced by our own personality and our skills. Let me give you a simple example from my own life. When I was a small boy, my mother said that I had a very loud voice, and the only way she could get me to stop talking was to give me a book to read. So she took me to the public library, and I got the habit of reading 2 or 3 books a week for the whole of my childhood and teenage years. So what can a person do with a loud voice who's read a lot of books, but become a teacher? But our jobs are not just determined by our personality, but in turn they shape our personality as well. My choice of occupation as a teacher taught me quite a bit. I had to learn to plan ahead. I had to learn to be honest with myself about learning from my mistakes when lessons went disastrously wrong. I had to learn to communicate by speaking, by listening, and by observing people's faces and body language. That's something I miss now when I'm giving this talk on a laptop instead of to a room full of people. I had to learn assertiveness, time management, and basic counseling skills. My desire to learn to cope with the stresses of the job led me to a newly opened Buddhist center in an old fire station in Bethnal Green. I thought that maybe learning to meditate would help me cope with the stress of my job. You'll probably be pleased to know that it does. Now, let's just pause there for a moment. I've tried to give us an idea of how important work is for us. Work is so much more than just a paycheck. It doesn't just give us an income. It gives us an identity. And though the work we do is partly the outcome of our personality, it also has a tremendous influence on shaping our personality. It's no wonder the Buddha thought right livelihood mattered. Now let's go on to part 2 and see what traditional Buddhist literature has to say about right livelihood. You may be surprised to hear that it doesn't say very much. Right livelihood is there as item number 5 of the Buddha's Noble Eightfold Path. But the Buddha himself doesn't say a huge amount about it. The reason is quite easy to understand. The Buddha was living in a traditional society where social change happened very slowly. Most people did the same jobs that their grandparents had done and expected that their grandchildren would do the same job as well. The jobs actually available did not change over hundreds of years. Most people had very little choice about what jobs they did, and to try and change their job might be dangerous or even illegal, as under the later Indian caste system. In a little sutta called the Vajjayana Sutta, the Buddha tells us 5 types of jobs to avoid. Here they are. Trade in weapons, trade in people, slave trading, trade in meat, butchery, trade in alcohol, like running a pub, and trade in poison. I better explain the last one. Apparently, if you wanted to get rid of somebody awkward, you could buy some poison for the purpose if you just happened to know the right people. However, the Buddha thought that was a bad idea, and so do I. The Buddha also talked about the characteristics of wrong ways of earning a living. And they were things that involved scheming, persuading, hurting, belittling, or pursuing gain with gain, which I think means excessive profiteering. Now, it really might be an interesting exercise to think of some modern day equivalents for that little list. I'll just repeat them again. Scheming, persuading, hurting, belittling, pursuing gain with gain. In another sutta, it's called the Digajanu Sutta, the Buddha talks about the benefits of an honest livelihood. He tells us to become skillful at our jobs and not to be lazy. He specifically mentions as occupations he seems to approve of farming, trading, rearing cattle, and doing service to the king. He tells us to spend time with good friends and keep our spending within our income. He also tells us to enjoy using our income with charity and generosity. In one of the numerical discourses that are called the Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha goes a little bit further and actually tells us how to enjoy what we earn through honest toil. He describes 4 enjoyments, which he calls 4 appropriate happinesses. The first appropriate happiness is the happiness of ownership. The sutta says, quote, "A son of good family possesses wealth that has been obtained through his own diligent labor, acquired through the strength of his own arms and the sweat of his own brow, rightly acquired, rightly gained. He experiences happiness thinking, I possess this wealth that has been obtained by my own diligent labor, acquired through the strength of my own arms and the sweat of my own brow, rightly acquired, rightly gained. This is the happiness of ownership." Now, the sutta continues in a characteristically long-winded and repetitive way to the second happiness, which is the happiness of enjoyment. Quote, "Through this wealth that has been obtained through my own diligent labor, acquired through the strength of my own arms and the strength of my own brow, rightly acquired, rightly gained, I have derived benefit and performed good works." It's very significant to me that the Buddha spoke about performing good works as an integral part of the enjoyment of what you earn. Generosity for the Buddha was not painful, but enjoyable. Not an optional extra, but an integral part of the benefits of hard work. The third appropriate happiness is freedom from debt. I won't read through the whole passage again, you get the picture as to how it works. But the Buddha says the fourth appropriate happiness is the most important. The fourth appropriate happiness is the happiness of blamelessness. He experiences pleasure and happiness thinking, I am possessed of blameless bodily actions, blameless speech, and blameless thoughts. When he realizes the happiness of being free from debt, he's in a position to appreciate the happiness of owning possessions. As he uses his possessions, he experiences the happiness of enjoyment. Clearly saying this, the wise man, comparing the first three kinds of happiness with the last, says that they are not worth the 16th part of the happiness that arises from blameless behavior. He tells us to enjoy what we've earned and to enjoy freedom from debt. He reminds us that generosity and good works are an integral part of the enjoyment of the fruits of our labor. Giving to others is not a burden and not an optional extra. It's an integral part of the enjoyment. But above all else, the Buddha tells us to do work which leaves our consciences clear. The Buddha seems quite relaxed about people being prosperous, as long as one's prosperity is honestly earned and used for the benefit of all. Buddhism does not see any virtue in poverty. The great 20th century Indian Buddhist, Dr. Ambedkar, put it like this, quote, religion must not sanctify or ennoble poverty. Renunciation of riches by those who have it may be a blessed state, but poverty can never be. To declare poverty to be a blessed state is to pervert religion, to perpetuate vice and crime, to consent to make earth a living hell. The poor are not blessed. So Buddhism does not so much ask as what you've got, but instead asks how you got it and what you do with it. In the famous Sigalovada Sutra, the Buddha talks about the ideal relationship between employer and employee. Here, the Buddha describes employers and employees as having an equal amount of duties and responsibilities to one another. The duties of an employer are 5 in number. 1, to give staff work according to their ability. 2, to supply them with food and wages. 3, to tend them in sickness. 4, to share with them any delicacies. And 5, to grant them leave at times. Holidays are all right. Good thing too. The employees, in their turn, have 5 corresponding duties. 1, they rise before their employer. 2, they go to sleep after him. People work long hours in the past. I'm not quite sure what modern people would think about rising before their employer and going to sleep after him, but be that as it may. Number 3, employees take only what is given. Employees deal with an employer who is cruel or exploitative. How should they respond to instructions that may put themselves or others in danger? When might it be permissible to refuse to obey an order? And how should an employer deal with staff who are dishonest, uncooperative, or just plain lazy? When is it okay to sack somebody? We're not really told, and in the traditional very hierarchical society that the Buddha lived in, I imagine those discussions just didn't really take place. In the Sigalovada Sutra, the Buddha does entertain us with a list of excuses for idleness. I'll just rattle through them quickly because they are quite good fun. Quote, he does no work, saying, 1, that it is extremely cold, 2, that it is extremely hot, 3, that it is too late in the evening, 4, that it is too early in the morning, 5, that he is extremely hungry, 6, that he is too full. Living in this way, many duties undone, new wealth he does not get, and wealth he has acquired dwindles away. So we can sum up this whole second section by saying that the Buddha was clearly in favor of honest work and the enjoyment of the material rewards from it. It's slightly curious because we've got no evidence that the Buddha ever did a day's work himself, but that's by the by. He seems to have favored a prudent, careful approach to the money earned by honest work, but combined this with a strong encouragement of generosity. He may very well have approved of the likes of Bill Gates and George Soros, rich people with large charitable foundations. So there's the end of part 2. I'm just going to take a drink of water before we go on. Leave behind the very hierarchical, structured, traditional society that the Buddha lived and taught in, and get up to our own era and a few issues about right livelihood in our own times. Because today we live in a very different time. Most of the jobs that our grandparents did are obsolete. All of my grandparents were coal miners. Nobody much does that anymore. Young people today enter the labor market doing jobs that did not exist when they were born. Many of them will end their careers doing jobs that haven't been invented yet. At the same time, we have labor laws, trade unions, health and safety, equal opportunities, safeguarding. And we've spent the last couple of 100 years having debates about industrial relations, on-the-job training, and the rights of employers and employees. In some countries, like France, for example, labor is quite heavily protected by law. In others, like the United States, it's hardly protected at all. And we can choose our jobs, or we can change them freely. We talk about issues like job satisfaction and work-life balance. In the last few weeks, most of us have learned to work in very new ways. 2 months ago, I'd never heard of Zoom. Now I wish I'd bought shares in it. I have the enjoyment of co-leading, I should say, a little study group on Zoom on a Thursday evening. But some of the people come to the study group and say, I've spent 7 hours on Zoom today. I've got square eyes. I can hardly cope. So we're living in a time when work is changing very, very rapidly indeed. And as a society, we've developed a very strong idea in the last few weeks about who are the key workers whose work we simply cannot do without. we are very much aware of who quite rightly gets clapped on a Thursday evening and why. So it's no wonder that our ideas of right livelihood need to develop and build on what the Buddha taught over 2,000 years ago. And during the 20th century, some Buddhists began to try and do exactly that. I'm just going to quickly mention some ideas from an American Theravadan teacher called Jack Kornfield, and then have a look at our own experience in the Triratna movement. Both developed ideas about right livelihood in the late 20th and early 21st century. Jack Kornfield lists 5 aspects of a modern day right livelihood. Here we go. Avoid work which causes harm. So not harming and actually helping other people. 2, giving you appropriate happiness. The same list of 4 things the Buddha mentioned before. I'll give you it again in a moment. 3, stimulating you to grow and become more ethical. In plain language, treating work itself as a spiritual practice. 4, simplicity. A right livelihood should give you adequate support for a simple life. You don't need the Porsche. And number 5, service. That your livelihood should produce benefit to other people and to society as a whole. And Jack Kornfield's appropriate happiness is the same 4 happinesses that I mentioned by the Buddha a little while ago. I like the list, so I'll read it again. The happiness of ownership, joy in what you've got. The happiness of enjoyment, joy in using what you've got, spending your earnings to benefit yourself and others. The happiness of being free from debt, joy in being independent. The pleasure of being free from debt and charity and handouts. And 4, the best of the lot, the happiness of blamelessness. Earning your living ethically, leaving you with a clear conscience that you're doing no harm and at least some good. Now I'll go on and say a little bit about our own beloved movement. From the 1970s onwards, what used to be called the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order sought to develop right livelihood businesses to offer employment to our own members and supporters. And some of these became very successful for a time at least. They included vegetarian restaurants, a whole food shop, a chain of gift shops, a cafe for festivals, a huge great warehouse supplying the gift shops, as well as teams of staff for retreat centres in the countryside and teams of staff for urban centres like, I was going to say this one, the one we'd all like to be sitting in if we could be at the moment. In addition, last summer I had the pleasure of meeting an Indian order member who's founded 2 primary schools and also a savings bank which operates from the top floor of his house. There are no limits to some people's initiative and ingenuity. Now, there were some straightforward ideas behind those right livelihood businesses. The first was that they gave workers support rather than a salary. The idea was to meet each worker's individual needs. Now, I have to say that the word needs was interpreted rather strictly, and the financial rewards were not large. Second, The work should be ethical and the business run in an ethical way, with people treating each other ethically. Thirdly, Buddhists should work with other Buddhists and so be able to develop spiritual friendship, something our movement's always considered to be very important. And finally, the good old Buddhist principle of generosity. The profits from these businesses should be given away to support other FWBO activities. Now, in practice, this tended to mean businesses run as co-ops or on cooperative lines. The staff often shared the same accommodation, thus living together as well as working together. There was a very strong emphasis on the teamwork aspect, and the teams at the time were almost always single sex, because that was a strong part of FWBO thinking at the time. It's somewhat less so today. The businesses were in what economists know as contestable markets, markets that are easy for new companies to join. And I'm afraid that tends to result in both low profit and low pay. And although many of the workers were graduates, much of the work was quite low skilled. As time went on, it became harder to staff these businesses. Modern day graduates come saddled with high levels of debt and are less willing to do minimum wage work. Vegetarian restaurants and organic groceries were once highly unusual, but have now gone mainstream, and some are run by big chains. And internet trading undercut both the gift shops and the warehouse. I'm happy to say that some Right Livelihood businesses continue to thrive. Lama's Pajamas in Bethnal Green meets a seemingly inexhaustible demand for vintage clothing. New View Residential in Cambridge meets an equally inexhaustible demand from tenants for ethical landlords and from property owners for ways to earn a rental without ripping their tenants off. It is difficult to start a successful Right Livelihood business, even harder than starting a local centre like our own North London centre. Today, most of our committed supporters work in conventional employment or self-employment. I'm happy to say that shortly before the lockdown, our friends down the road at the London Buddhist Centre in Bethnal Green held a day event called Build a Buddhist Business. There are several reports and talks from this event online. They're quite easy to Google. There's quite a lot to look at there if you think it's interesting. And I have included a link to a stimulus sheet that they call the Canvas. If you're interested in starting a Buddhist business, with the handout for this talk. Once upon a time, I thought in an old-fashioned kind of way, I'd be able to smile at all of you at the end of the talk and hand out a nice printed piece of paper with stuff on it. I think we'll try and find a way of getting that all online. I hope at least some of you will be interested in that. Phew. Well, in this talk, I've whizzed through quite a lot of ideas about right livelihood, but I think Ratnaprabha likes using these talks to stimulate discussion, so I thought I'd better make sure there was something there. I've tried to show that our right livelihood means much more than just a wage or a salary. It shapes every aspect of our lives. I've tried to show how the Buddha considered right livelihood to be an important aspect of the spiritual life. But in the context of a traditional society, he mostly confined himself to urging people to avoid obviously unethical livelihoods, and to urging people to do their very best in whatever livelihood they happen to have been born into. And I've tried to show how modern day Buddhists have tried to develop the idea of right livelihood so that work becomes a means of personal development rather than just a rather tiresome necessity. It can be all too easy to see the work we do as an irritating nuisance, as something that we're obliged to do when we'd rather be meditating or doing long retreats or something like that. I'd like to finish this talk by countering that view, by offering you a quote by Sangharakshita that I hope you'll find helpful. It comes from a book called Wisdom Beyond Words, which doesn't have an awful lot about work in it, but it's a brilliant book. I definitely recommend it. Anyway, the quote goes like this, quote, "Our everyday life may be pleasurable or painful, wildly ecstatic or unbearably agonizing, or just plain dull and boring much of the time. But it is here, in the midst of all these experiences, good, bad, and indifferent, and nowhere else, that enlightenment is to be attained." I hope that you've heard at least something worthwhile from this talk. Thank you all for listening to me today.
Thank you very much, Kusala, for that. There's been a couple of questions in the chat. Shall I pass them on to you, and anyone else who wants to put one in the chat, and I'll unmute us in a couple of minutes as well.
Okay, doke.
So Anna was saying that you mentioned that the Buddha didn't do any work, but isn't teaching work?
I suppose really what I meant is that the Buddha, we don't have any records of the Buddha doing what might be conventionally described as work. In Ireland, people used to ask, did they dig turf? No. We don't ever really see the Buddha getting his hands dirty or getting a hold of a shovel or something like that. Although there is a very good story about the Buddha cleaning up a rather distressed sick monk who got dysentery. But I suppose I'm thinking of the contrast between the Christian image of Jesus as a skilled craftsman. The Buddha never, as far as I know, had a conventional job.